you. Thank you very much. And again, sorry for the delay, but delighted to be with you. And I'm going to introduce this topic because I think it's quite relevant for our thinking in the West, ecological civilization and traditional Chinese thought. So let me begin with the first slide. There we go. So here's just a definition of ecological civilization: an aspiration for the future, moving from an industrial society in China with unlimited economic growth that is polluting land, air, and water to an ecological civilization that provides a basis for the well-being and health of both people and planet. So this is how the Chinese are defining it, but a number of very key environmentalists and intellectuals are picking up on this idea. Next slide. So as we know, modernization in China over the last 75 years, with intense economic and social development, the Chinese government has lifted millions of people out of poverty. This is an accomplishment never before reached in human history on this scale. However, there were unintended consequences of pollution of air, water, and soil. Food safety issues arose along with local protests. 2013, there were 50,000 protests around the environment. So the government knew they had to do something. It was clear a change needed to happen from an industrial revolution to ecological civilization. Fine, next slide. So from sustainability to flourishing, a broader vision for systemic changes in China is now in the Chinese constitution since 2018. These are the words: to promote the coordinated development of material civilization, political civilization, spiritual civilization, social civilization, and ecological civilization. Next. So the carbon neutral goal for China is quite ambitious. In 2020, it was announced that China aims to peak emissions before 2030 and go carbon neutral by 2060 in accordance with the Paris Climate Agreement. If accomplished, it would lower the expected rise in global temperature by 0.2 to 0.3 degrees, and this is the biggest single reduction ever estimated by the Climate Action Tracker. Most people in the West have no idea of this commitment. Let's go to the next slide. So the major transition to renewable energy from unsustainable coal power plants in September 2021, China said they would not build coal-fired power projects abroad. They're still building them, as we know, in China. This is a transition period. They're going, as you also know, to sustainable solar panels and electric vehicles. It's the largest world producer of these by far. But there's also an element here of renewing the human spirit, a new human energy. And this is reviving a worldview that promotes a viable planetary future, which includes Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. Next slide. So the paradigm shift is needed for people and the planet. This implies shifting from an anthropocentric to an ecocentric worldview in China and the West, namely from a human-focused perspective to an organic, holistic worldview. This will take time. Next slide. So this anthropocosmic worldview, in a Chinese context, this implies a broad paradigm shift from a human-dominating worldview to a recovery of an anthropocosmic worldview, where humans are situated within the cosmos and Earth. This is needed around the world, in Asia and the West, and is already present in native traditions. This is a term that Due Ming, a very famous Chinese scholar, has used widely, the anthropocosmic worldview, but it comes from Eliade, the historian of world religions. Next slide. So harmony with nature is what the Chinese are pressing for, Tianren He, that humans are not independent from the world, but interdependent with the dynamic unfolding forces of heaven, the universe, and Earth. This is compatible with the sciences of evolution and ecology, as well as with traditional Chinese thought. It fosters an organic holism and harmony of humans with nature in Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. It should be said that, of course, this is an aspiration. This is in process. There are many ecological problems still in China, but by and large, the cities, the air is so much better than when I first went. And here's the next slide. So the shift in Chinese universities and academia is quite apparent. Been visiting China since '85 and seen many, many changes. In September 2023 and in the summer, this past summer, we saw the presence of ecological civilization in ideas and practice at numerous academic institutions. We visited from Datong in the north to Pu'er in the south, along with the revival of Chinese philosophy and culture. Every institution that we visited was 8 last summer and about 6 this past, September. Anyway, we've been to well over a dozen of these institutions, academic, and they all have centers or institutes for ecological civilization, which would be like sustainability in our Western context. But here, the values are very important. What are the values that drive this shift? Next slide. So our encounter, I'm talking our being John Grimm, my husband, and myself, with China and Confucianism. And early interest in China was sparked by our teachers, Theodore de Bary and Thomas Berry. They traveled together to Beijing in 1948 to study Chinese language and culture, especially Confucianism. Then they taught us Chinese traditions at Columbia, where I did my PhD, and at Fordham, where John did his PhD. Next slide. So Thomas Berry, as some of you know, was one of the leading spokespersons for the critical nature of our environmental crisis, well, early on in the 80s. And next slide. He was a scholar of world religions, had a library of 10,000 books in Riverdale outside of New York. He ran and founded the History of Religions program at Fordham that had 25 PhDs graduate from it. He was a specialist in Confucianism. He realized this environmental crisis very early, and he encouraged our work in world religions and ecology at Harvard, where we did conferences and 10 books. Next slide. So Ted de Bary, he was actually a student of my grandfather's at Columbia. My grandfather was a historian of modern Europe and helped found the field of nationalism. But Ted was a student of Carlton Hayes, my grandfather. And next slide. He was the foremost scholar of Neo-Confucianism in the West. Many, many publications and conferences. He helped to create Asian studies in the US through courses at Columbia on China, on India, Japan, and Korea. He founded the translations of Asian classics, which is a series from Columbia Press, and promoted Asian philosophy widely. Next. So Win-Tit Chan was also my teacher at Columbia, and I'm going to China in November for a number of conferences, but the first one is to celebrate the 30th anniversary of his passing. Next slide. So he was, of course, one of the leading scholars and translators as well. He did the source book in Chinese philosophy from Princeton, the sources of Chinese tradition from Columbia. Zhu Xi, the major Neo-Confucian thinker, translated his primary work, and Wang Yangming. So this was a leading scholar and translator, Win-Tit Chan. Next. So I'll skip over this, but he's considered a person who transmitted the way and from China to the West, and then the retransmission back to the West. Okay, next slide. Back to China, I mean. Now, Dui Ming is a part of the new Confucians. So the Confucian scholars came out of China when Mao took over. They set up their studies and their research in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and Dui Ming came out as well and studied in Taiwan with some of these great leading scholars. And it must be said that they kept Confucianism alive by a thread, because it was destroyed, as you know, by Mao. The Cultural Revolution was quite devastating, but they kept it alive with dialogue with the West and some German philosophers and others. And now, it took about 10 years to revive it in China, but Confucianism is being taught in the schools. They know their classics once again. But it's a remarkable story, and Dui Ming, who's a close friend and helped us with the Harvard conferences, was key in this revival along with our teachers, Barry and DeBerry. Next slide. So he is a great scholar of Neo-Confucian, director of this Institute for Advanced Humanistic Studies at Peking University, which was set up to counteract the high level of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math in China, and so that they wouldn't lose their humanistic traditions. He's also been a research professor at Harvard, where he taught up to 2000. And we published together 2 volumes of Confucian spirituality with scholars from the US and China. Next slide. So his article in Daedalus was very critical, for he was talking about this ecological turn in new Confucian humanism and its implications for China and the world. I'll just read this. By identifying the comprehensive unity of heaven, earth, and humanity as a critical contribution to the modern world, key figures in new Confucianism thought signaled the movement toward both retrieval and reappropriation of Confucian ideas. And we can say more about that. I want to underscore none of this is smooth or just so totally optimistic. There are many, many struggles about this revival of Confucianism, even down to the present. Also, I do want to underscore there's obviously authoritarianism very much present in China today. But the effort that we're involved in is, you could say, citizen diplomacy, but to affirm the comprehensive power, elegance, and efficacy of Confucianism in this particular moment of trying to establish the aspiration of an ecological civilization. All of this is aspirational against great odds. I just want to underscore that. We can talk about it in the discussion. Next slide. So he got the World Congress of Philosophy, which meets every 5 years. The latest one was in Rome in August, which I went to. But he got it to come to China in 2018. There's only been 2 outside the West, one in Korea and one in China. The next one will be in Japan 5 years from now. And he's calling Confucian a spiritual humanism of self, community, earth, and heaven. This plenary, to thousands of people, just one line from it. The creativity since the Big Bang has never been lost, but accumulated in every segment of the evolutionary story: sun, earth, life, animal, and human. We are the inheritors of this cosmic energy. We are charged with the responsibility to see to it that what has been endowed in our nature continues to give generative power to new realities and life forms. Dui Ming is very much influenced by Thomas Berry, in this Journey of the Universe perspective of the film and book that we did on the story of evolution. Okay, next slide. Now, another person who influenced Journey of the Universe and our work and Thomas Berry's work is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who's a Jesuit, paleontologist, geologist, who spent decades in China during the war because the Jesuits were concerned about his very progressive ideas and so on. But he was involved in the discovery of Peking man. We've seen some of his discoveries in the museums in China, and highly respected and still known in the scientific community in China. Next slide. So he was a geologist and so on of Earth and universe history. These are the dates when he was in China, Peking man. The Teilhard's anthropocosmic ideas inspired many, including our Journey of the Universe film and book. And he was closely linked to his ideas are closely linked to Chinese thought, even though he didn't know Confucianism. And John and I led the American Teilhard Association for 40 years. Okay, next slide. Another key thinker is Whitehead, whose process thought is very much involved in this ecological civilization through the Claremont School with John Cobb. Let's go to the next slide. So Whitehead's contributions of process philosophy are similar to the dynamic and holistic philosophy of Confucianism and Taoism. And he's an important philosopher in this dialogue between China and the West. The Center for Process Studies at Claremont in California has done 17 conferences on this topic. And these John Cobb and Wang and Fawn have been friends for many, many years, and we've traveled to China with them. Next slide. Now, Han Yue is one of the most influential scholar officials in China. Let's go to the next slide. He encouraged ecological civilization from 2006. He was Vice Minister of China's State Environmental Protection Administration, which is like our EPA. He's now the Director of National Ethnic Affairs. And he did a conference on the history and future of Xinjiang, which is the most western province of China, up against Pakistan and all the stans. And we went to that conference this summer. And he has promoted Chinese philosophy for ecological ethics. He has a PhD in history of Chinese philosophy, but he notes that environmental laws can't be enforced without an environmental culture and values. And we met him in 2008 and have been lightly in touch with him over these years, because he understands that the conferences we did at Harvard, which we'll talk about in a minute, we're trying to do what he's doing, namely promote Confucian and Taoist values for an ecological ethic in China. So this notion of ecological, next slide, this notion of ecological and cultural values from the world's cultures and religions can inspire diverse perspectives on environmental ethics. This is true in both China and the West. This is why we did these conferences, 10 conferences and 10 books. We said the environmental ethics in India will have to have their own traditions of Hinduism and Jainism and so on, and the same for China. And that's what's happening now, much to our surprise, in China. Okay, next slide. So we did this series, World Religions and Ecology, at the Harvard Center for the Study of World Religions, with the same idea that Du Ming referred to, the notion of retrieval, a reevaluation, and reconstruction, saying that all these traditions, Asian and Western traditions, were originated in a completely different time and circumstances, but many of their teachings, their ideas, even their practices, and their scriptures can be reinterpreted in light of the most pressing problems of our time, which, of course, is the ecological crisis, the climate crisis, and so on. So as you can see on the left, we also included indigenous traditions, which was an extraordinary conference that John organized because that's his specialty. And the books on Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism have been translated into Chinese. Okay, so we're coming to sort of a summary of, next slide, of the Confucian holistic worldview and ethics, again, in the ideal form, the aspirational form. But this is an anthropocosmic rather than an anthropocentric perspective, with the organic holism of the unity of cosmos, earth, and human. There's no radical transcendence in this tradition. There's no break. There's no idea of a salvation outside the systems of cosmos, earth, and human. Du Ming wrote a very well-known article called The Continuity of Being, which describes this. Next slide. So this is a dynamic vitalism of material force, which is qi, which is matter energy, that flows through everything, the universe, humans, animals, plants, and so on. But it's considered a basis for comprehensive ecological ethics, that humans and nature are one, which of course we're trying to rediscover in the West as well. So just a few examples of this from some texts. Next slide. So the Da Shui, The Great Learning, is one of the 4 books that are central to the teaching of Confucianism for millennia. And the idea is the individual is not isolated, but part of a community, that reciprocal responsibilities to the social and natural communities is essential, that self-cultivation influences the whole, and that the concentric circles of the person, the family, society, education, the political order, the earth, and universe are one. So the idea is, as one cultivates oneself, one is influencing this whole, like a stone put into a pond, the ripple effect. But the notion is this is not self-cultivation for personal enlightenment or for personal salvation. It's for a common good. And that's why Pan Yue, as a scholar official, is the ideal of a Confucian official who was supposed to do that kind of learning and cultivation for the larger society. Next slide. So here's an example of a Neo-Confucian philosopher, Zhang Sai, who's had an enormous influence in China. And every Chinese will recognize this next slide of the Western inscription, where he says, he wrote this on the wall of his study, "Heaven is my father and earth is my mother, and even such a small creature as I finds an intimate place in their midst." Next slide. "Therefore, that which fills the universe I regard as my body, and that which directs the universe I consider as my nature. All peoples are my brothers and sisters, and all things are my companions." Next. "The sage identifies his character with that of heaven and earth, and the worthy is the most outstanding person. Even those who have no brothers or children, wives or husbands, all are my brothers who are in distress and have no one to turn to." Next. So this is a filiality of compassion and care. Filiality is a huge virtue in China, as you know. So the notion of the expansion to include the cosmos as father and earth as mother, not just a biological father and mother. And this is considered not simply metaphorical, but you could say evolutionary, but also the notion is in praxis. So that exercising respect for nature and not overexploitation is an ideal that's being revived, again, against great odds. And I want to underscore that China has not had an ideal history of the treatment of its own land and forests and so on. But I do want to say right now, we discovered this summer, Beijing has 49% of its area covered by trees, parks, or forests, which is quite amazing. So the revival of urban centers, the effort to clean up pollution of air and soil, and especially food security, is very much ongoing. There's a long way to go with 1.3 billion people. This is going to be a long process. But here's another very famous text called the Zhongyong, the Mean, the Doctrine of the Mean, which urges humans to align with the dynamic and nurturing forces of heaven and earth, so that this is the idea is we're doing this physically with renewable energy of solar, wind, and geothermal. But the notion is, as we do this, as we're cultivating ourselves, which is the Confucian idea, we're drawing in the qi and the dynamic energy for the work that needs to be done. We know we're in a period of great eco-anxiety, climate grief. Our next generation is mentally anguished by the state of the world, and so are many of us. So I'm going to do the next slide on the person that I studied at Columbia and did my graduate work on, Kaibara Eken, which is the inspiration for a lot of this work. He's a Japanese philosopher and botanist. He's considered the Aristotle of Japan because of his study of plants and fish and trees. He categorized in the natural history tradition of China many aspects of nature. But he said, as you study nature, you also cultivate yourself. Next slide. These are the two books, Moral and Spiritual Cultivation in Japanese Neo-Confucianism, and A Philosophy of Qi, which is a very interesting philosophical argument about qi and li, which is an idea of principle in relationship to the dynamic forces of qi. And this argument is held in China, in Korea, and Japan by leading figures. And this is the leading figure in Japan who picks up this argument of how they interact. So let's go to the next slide, and we're coming to conclusion here. So we have then a basis for ecological ethics and action from this tradition. Again, aspirational, but emerging. So heaven and earth give birth to and nourish all things. And Eken aspires to activate humans at home, to be at home in the cosmos, humans completing a triad with heaven and earth, and humans restoring filial gratitude to nature for the immense gifts of life. These are the heart of his philosophy of Qi. So you can see a 17th century figure is following Zhangzai, an 11th century figure in the sense of filiality and gratitude for the gifts of life. And he would say, as you study a plant, a tree, and try and understand its pattern, its lead, its inner ordering principle, you're cultivating yourself in that relationship. So, in conclusion, we have, next slide, a sense of reciprocity, which refers to the importance of working for the common good, not simply for individual gain. We have such hyper-individualism here in the West, but especially in the US, I have to say. But in a Confucian context, this implies both individual self-cultivation and communal effort for a flourishing society. Okay, next slide. The reintegration indicates combining knowledge and practice to contribute for the betterment of society. In a Confucian context, this implies educating oneself in practical matters, such as science and technology, as well as matters of principles and values in the humanities. The Confucians were enormously involved in agricultural well-being and had enormous, as you probably know, irrigation systems, one of which is still being used way over in the West in Sichuan. They had ways to store grain, et cetera. So they were not just philosophers sitting in their rooms writing calligraphy or something. Those who were in public office, and they were supposed to go into public office on the merit of who they were and their character, of course, again, an ideal. But the civil service exams of China were taken up by the French philosophes and had an influence in the Enlightenment period, that they saw Confucian humanism as a very enlightened, both public philosophy, political philosophy, and personal philosophy. Okay, to the final R of renewal. So, next slide. Renewal then points to the need for renewable energies for people and the planet, and making the transition to ecological civilization and net zero carbon emissions. In a Confucian context, this implies shifting to regenerative energy processes for both the environment and the individual. Final slide. So, a shared planetary future, again, an ideal amidst many difficult circumstances we're facing right now. But we have the knowledge of science, policy, law, technology, and economics to make a shift. But we need ecological culture and values to create the context for ecological civilization to flourish in China and the West. So this notion of joining in a mutual effort for the future of the Earth community, we have a website and so on. I'm afraid the next slide has some QR codes, but I don't think they still work. But the idea is we're trying to bring this notion of what's happening in China to a Western audience through a website that we have. If you Google ecological civilization, Yale, I think it should come up. And we'll be going back, as I say, in November to give talks on this and to be citizen diplomats, if you will, in a very, very complicated situation in China, where there's very few foreigners traveling there now, very few students studying there now. But we feel it's important to keep this dialogue going, just as many people did that in the Soviet Union days with arts and music and so on. So I'm very open to listening to Marcus's response and to any of your questions or comments, critical or constructive, however they might be. Thank you so much for listening, and thanks for your patience waiting for this.